5 things that I think particularly speak to libraries from these data, and I'm sure you're seeing it in your communities already. I'm sure you're thinking about it, and so in many respects, I will just be echoing experiences I think you've already had. So people are particularly now thinking about libraries, relying on libraries, will be appreciative of the libraries when they're sanctuaries, trusted information resources, helpers of families, community strengtheners, and democracy anchors. In the context of library as sanctuary, you might remember these data that we collected a couple of years ago from library users. And having a quiet, safe place in a community, you know, ranks in the public imagination almost as importantly as books and media. And is sort of equivalent to librarian assistance as something that local libraries are cherished for. I cannot, and you know, in a way, it's of course a challenge that in many cases you can't open your libraries to be this kind of sanctuary, or can't open them under normal conditions to be these kinds of sanctuaries. But thinking hard about this aspect of your role in people's lives is a really important thing to do, and is sort of intensified in importance, I think, since the pandemic began and other crises have convulsed the culture. Libraries have always been seen as trusted information sources. This compares librarians with a variety of other sources. Of course, you stack up incredibly well compared to social media and things like that, but even compared with families and friends and news organizations and government sources, librarians and libraries just particularly stand out as a place where people are relying on you to help navigate them in these increasingly challenging times to important information. And part of the issue here is that people are deeply confused about what's going on. There's so many contending points of view and arguments about, is the coronavirus real? Does wearing a mask really help? How important is testing? How sick do you get when you get the pandemic, when you get COVID-19? And so I think librarians are sort of in a centrally important place on that. These are data that we actually collected a while ago about misinformation and its problem in the culture. And now 50% of Americans say that made up news and information is a big problem in the culture. This is a reading that was, of course, taken before the pandemic and the racial justice protests. But you can see that it's, you know, made up information is now in the public imagination a huge crisis. 2/3 of people say that it's such a bad problem that it affects Americans' confidence in judgment. Confidence in their government. It affects Americans' confidence in each other, which is a new kind of finding, and it affects political leaders' ability to get their work done. So it's not just a sort of abstract idea to Americans. Misinformation has a real price that it's extracting on the culture in lots of ways. You know, there's a way now that the sort of polarized information environment has made people suspicious of the president in particular in this slide, but also in sort of all kinds of official sources of information. This is the slide that shows you a variety of different information sources, particularly related to the pandemic. Democrats, more than Republicans, are likely to say that the CDC and public health organizations get the facts right almost all the time. The local news media gets the facts right almost all the time. The news media in general gets facts right. The governor of their state gets the facts right, and I think there's a local officials under that. Nope, it's just governors in the state. Friends and family are a little bit more iffy. And then, you know, the Trump administration sort of stands apart as an information source that a lot of Democrats don't particularly trust, and Republicans are more likely to trust it. But this is it speaks to the politicization of information and the weaponization of information. It now shows up in our data where significant numbers of people now say that they're not sure that they would get a vaccine if the vaccine were available. So 51% of Americans in an early September poll said that they would definitely or probably get a vaccine. That's down in a couple of months from the May reading we got on that question, so that the information environment is now confusing them, and obviously the logistics environment is confusing them. Democrats are more likely than Republicans to be wary. But I'm sorry, Republicans are more likely than Democrats to be wary of the vaccine. But everybody, it's falling across the board, and And so that's a big thing to notice, and it speaks to the problems in the culture. This slide is like a perfect slide showing the value of librarians in many cases as a family helper. We asked people early on in the pandemic about the homework gap and whether people would struggle to get, whether their kids who were out of school would have to do their schoolwork on a cell phone, have to get a public Wi-Fi source because they didn't have a reliable internet connection at their home, not be able to complete their schoolwork because they didn't have access to a computer at home. At the very bottom there, in the lower right, if you add up all the people who said yes to one of those problems related to the homework gap, 59% have at least one of those problems if they lived in a lower income home. So the way in which kids are struggling to complete their schoolwork in the pandemic is a big part of the story. And of course, libraries for years have been very focused on this problem, and your communities are relying on you related to that. Libraries are community strengtheners. We did a series of studies about trust in America, particularly interpersonal trust in America. You might not see that there's a library reference on this slide, but what it speaks to is the palpable hunger that we picked up in our survey about people thinking that the only way the country is going to dig its way out of the trust problems we are experiencing, the information problems we are experiencing, the trust in institutions problems that we are experiencing, is a grassroots kind of change in behavior where neighbors begin to talk to neighbors, where people open up and have honest conversations with each other about their political differences, where people band together to solve local problems, even if they don't necessarily agree with each other politically. The point to make here is that people think that the grassroots is the only thing that's going to save the country from a continued downward spiral here. And you guys are the center anchor institution where much of this rebuilding effort, where much of the trust effort can be anchored. And the final point I'm going to make here is that while Americans are quite angry and quite upset with the state of things, they think, as a rule, this is so American that the country can always find its way to solve problems. And interestingly enough, Republicans are more likely to say that than Democrats. And it speaks to, I think, the grandest issue that libraries can think about for themselves is that you're anchors for democracy, not only in your communities, not only maybe in enabling voting or giving good information about what's going on in the community related to politics and civic life and things like that. But, you know, libraries are institutions of hope.